At the tail end of the Enlightenment, a German philosopher questioned what the Enlightenment was. Enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. Self-incurred is this tutelage when its cause lies not in lack of reason, but in lack of resolution and courage to use it without direction from another. Sapere aude. Dare to know things through reason. That is the motto of enlightenment. The Enlightenment as we know it today was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated Europe in the 1600s and 1700s. People started to value reason, personal freedom, and questioned authority, permanently changing how we think about politics, science, and society forever. It pushed back against the control of the church and kings, promoting knowledge, freedom, and making life better through clear, rational thinking. As Immanuel Kant defined it, enlightenment was about the courage to use one's own understanding and the capacity to reason independently, a concept that would greatly influence Europe's Age of Reason. Part 1. The Age of Absolutism. The first inklings of the Enlightenment emerged out of the complex situation in Europe during the early modern period. Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was a continent undergoing great change and transformation. Countries like France, England, and Spain were building powerful governments, while smaller and weaker states struggled to keep up. During this time, monarchs started to take more control, reducing the power of local nobles and church leaders. This phenomena, called absolutism, saw rulers gain a lot of power. Nobles still held some of their power through their large estates, where peasants, often treated unfairly, worked hard for little reward. In Eastern Europe, nobles had even more control over the peasants. In places like Poland, its weak government allowed the nobles to act like mini-kings on their own estates. In Prussia, the nobles struck deals with their kings to keep their special privileges. In Russia, the government expanded serfdom to collect more taxes and reward its nobles. This overbearing control over people began to raise questions on how people should be ruled in the first place, and how governments should be ran. One place where kings did not have as much power was the Holy Roman Empire, which covered much of Central Europe. The empire was a mix of hundreds of small duchies and principalities, each with its own leaders, making it hard to rule as one country. The French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire famously joked that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, highlighting how outdated and chaotic it was. In Europe, the population grew slowly. There was just enough food being produced for the population to grow, but bad harvests, famine, and disease often erased these gains. Wars also hurt populations, not just through fighting, but by rooting crops and spreading diseases as soldiers and refugees moved around. Soldiers would destroy farms, loot villages, and terrorize people, sometimes on purpose as part of their orders. This was especially clear during the 30 Years' War in the early to mid-1600s, which rocked the Holy Roman Empire hard and caused massive devastation. Plagues, especially in cities around the Mediterranean, were a deadly issue. But as the 1700s approached, populations in places like England, Spain, Italy, Sweden, and Russia started growing again, though they had not fully recovered from the losses of the early 1600s. Even with this growth, survival still depended on how good the yearly harvest was. Most people in Europe were poor, ate poorly, and suffered from hunger and high death rates as a result. About a third of children in England and half in France did not live to see their 5th birthday. Most people lived in villages, and the local economy was focused on farming. Towns were small and cut off by bad roads. In Hungary, all the towns together had fewer people than Paris. In Bohemia, only Prague had a population of over 10,000 people. Even in France, about 85% of the population lived in small villages. Farming had not changed in centuries. Crops did not grow much. Fields were often empty due to a lack of manure to fertilize them, and animals were not in good shape. Industrial economies were not moving fast either. Most businesses stuck to traditional methods and followed guild rules, who held monopolies on production and new technology, which meant that big factories were rare. The biggest industrial change happened in Russia, where Peter the Great set up large-scale iron production in the Ural Mountains. One area that did change quickly was overseas trade. European explorers and colonists expanded trade networks, which aided Europe's economy. The discovery of the Americas and trade routes to Asia and Africa brought in immense wealth from precious metals, spices, and other goods. Port cities in Britain and France, like Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, and Bordeaux, thrived. Merchants became wealthier as a result, and so too did new banking institutions, giving rise to a new middle class in Europe. One big change in everyday European life was that more people learned to read and get an education. In the early modern period, the printing press, invented by Johann Gutenberg in 1440, changed how people shared information. Books, pamphlets, newspapers, and magazines became easier to produce and buy, and as a result, ideas spread across Europe more quickly and freely. A lot of this was due to the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg. He was fed up with the Catholic Church's corruption, and his actions ultimately split the Christian faith in Western Europe. Protestantism pushed people to think for themselves when it came to religion. It also encouraged translating the Bible into common languages, so everyday people could understand and interpret it on their own. As literacy grew, more people could engage with any new ideas that were to come in the future. Even though more people could read, many still feared what they did not understand. Natural events like comets and lightning were often seen as signs of God's anger or the end of the world. Martin Luther himself became a monk after being scared by a storm. Superstitions were everywhere. People feared bad luck from even simple things like spilling salt or seeing an owl at night. These fears would be prime grounds to challenge in the coming centuries as people went out of their way to conquer them. Part 2. The Scientific Revolution. The Enlightenment in Europe built on the changes already happening during the Scientific Revolution. Before the Scientific Revolution, people in medieval and Renaissance Europe used Aristotle's old ideas to understand the world. Aristotle thought knowledge came from deductive reasoning. For example, if it rains, the ground will be wet. If the ground is not wet, it is therefore not raining. By the 1500s, people began to see that this way of thinking did not explain much. Martin Luther emphasized that understanding certain events as simply what they were was better than seeing them as divine symbols or meanings. Comets should no longer be seen as bad omens, and thunder should no longer be thought of as God's voice. Not to mention that Aristotle's ideas themselves were being challenged. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus wrote on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. He said that the Earth and other planets revolve around the Sun, not the other way around like Aristotle believed. This heliocentric model of the solar system went against what people had believed for centuries, but thanks to the printing press, his ideas spread quickly. By the 1600s, Aristotle's ideas struggled to explain the strange things people were discovering about the natural world. Francis Bacon, an English philosopher, said people should base their fact and knowledge on experiments and real observable evidence, not just Aristotle's deductive reasoning. In other words, empirical evidence. He believes mankind should use new knowledge to attain happier, healthier lives. The true and lawful goal of the sciences, Bacon wrote, is none other than this, that human life be endowed and with new discoveries and power. Two key scientists took Bacon's empiricism and Copernicus's findings further. Johannes Kepler, a German astronomer, found that planets move around the sun in ellipses, that is, not the perfect circles that Aristotle theorized. Galileo Galilei, an Italian astronomer, used a telescope to prove that planets are not the perfect spheres Aristotle believed them to be by observing the moon's many ridges and bumps on its rocky surface. He also introduced the law of inertia, which says that an object, if once set in motion, moves with uniform velocity if no force acts on it. Going forward, Copernican thinking became the dominant understanding of the universe. The scientific revolution reached its peak with Isaac Newton, a brilliant English scientist. Newton was born in 1642, the same year Galileo died. At 22, during the Great Plague of 1665, he left Cambridge University and spent much of his time at home thinking. In just 18 months, he invented many of the principles of calculus, discovered that white light is made of colors, and figured out gravity, possibly and famously inspired by a falling apple. Newton was not in a hurry to share his work. In 1687, he finally published Principia Mathematica, which explained his famous laws of motion and gravity. He also publicly explored the properties of light in his 1704 book Optics. Though his reclusive personality and staggering genius made his contemporaries jealous and resentful, they nonetheless recognized him as one of the greatest scientists ever. Newton's scientific method, which stressed careful experiments, logical thinking, and rejected unproven ideas, further reinforced the core principles of the Enlightenment's empiricism. His discovery that the universe operated according to natural laws was significant for the Enlightenment going forward. During the Enlightenment, scientists focused on studying living things. Isaac Newton did not, but major contributions were made by Swedish scientist Carl Linnaeus, who tried to classify all plants and animals into a hierarchy so he could show the true order of nature: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. He believed nature never changed. The French scientist, the Comte de Buffon, disagreed, and thought that nature did change and had a much longer history than humans at the time believed. Using fossils, he showed that the earth was much older than the Bible said, which upset religious scholars. Many scientists of the Enlightenment focused on medicine too. Instead of listening to patient stories, doctors diagnosed their patients based on symptoms. They started using techniques like feeling, tapping, and listening to the body. Hospitals also began studying corpses to learn about diseases. However, most people still went to midwives and healers because doctors were too expensive, and hospitals mainly helped the rich. To add to this, major advancements were made in the understanding of human anatomy, as there was plenty left to learn and observe. For example, with the help of a new invention, the microscope, William Harvey had only just figured out in 1628 that the heart pumps blood. Later, 18th century scientists connected anatomy to functions like nerves and glands. Artists also studied anatomy to make their art better. By the end of the Enlightenment, science and medicine had made huge leaps. Science was now respected around the world, and doctors gained more authority. But for most ordinary people, not much changed in their daily lives, except for seeing more doctors during health crises. Part 3. Philosophy during the Enlightenment. If Francis Bacon gave science a solid base by focusing on empiricism, the French philosopher René Descartes did the same for Enlightenment philosophy by emphasizing logic and rationalism. Descartes wanted science to have an unshakable foundation, so he used doubt as his tool. He believed that if he removed all the ideas that could be false, especially ones that could trick him through his senses, like sight or sound, he would be left with the undeniable truth, which he thought came from God. Descartes encouraged doubting everything so as to encourage the use of reason and observation to come to conclusions. His doubts led him to one definite conclusion. The only thing that he could not doubt was that he existed. This made him famously declare, "I think, therefore I am." After Descartes, an English philosopher named John Locke came up with an alternative. In 1690, Locke wrote his essay concerning human understanding, where he said people do not have any ideas when they are born. Our minds at birth are a tabula rasa, blank slates, and everything we know comes from what we experience as we grow. Locke's belief that knowledge comes from experience was a major part of Enlightenment philosophy, challenging ideas about humans having knowledge or behaviors built in when they are born. As the Enlightenment continued into the 1700s, philosophers shifted from deep, abstract thinking to more practical matters like how humans behave, what's right and wrong, and how to run societies. In Scotland, David Hume took Locke's ideas and pushed them further. In his book, A Treatise of Human Nature, published between 1738 and 1740, Hume questioned how much we can really be sure of in science and philosophy. He argued that our understanding of the world comes from habit and experience, not pure logical thinking. In France, Enlightenment thinkers, known as the philosophes, applied reason to all parts of life, especially when criticizing superstition, ignorance, and oppressive governments. Voltaire, one of the most famous philosophers, spoke out for religious tolerance and free thinking. In his Philosophical Letters in 1733 and Candide in 1759, he mocked the overly optimistic views of thinkers like the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, who believed the universe was perfectly ordered and that this world was the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire's clever writing made complex ideas easy to understand, which made Enlightenment thinking more accessible to the wider public. Later in the Enlightenment, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant made a huge contribution. In 1781's Critique of Pure Reason, Kant tried to connect rationalism and empiricism. He believed that while all knowledge starts with experience, it's also shaped by how our minds work. Kant argued that we do not just passively take in information from the outside world, our minds actively organize what we see and experience. In his later work, Critique of Practical Reason, Kant focused on moral philosophy. He came up with the idea of the categorical imperative, which means that people should act in ways that could become universal rules. Kant's blend of logic and observation changed philosophy forever, influencing almost everything that came after. Part 4. The Role of God. As people learned more and put more focus on empiricism and rationalism during the Enlightenment, they started to question religion's role in society. The Christian faiths in Europe did not entirely fade away and become irrelevant in Europe, but they sure were challenged as the era's thinkers questioned religious institutions. This led to Christianity adapting to new religious ideas, criticisms, and even the rise of more secular beliefs. One key religious idea during the Enlightenment was deism. Deism is the belief that God exists, but does not interfere in the world. Deists believe humans could understand God through reason and nature, not through miracles or religious texts. They saw God as a distant creator who set the universe in motion but left it to run on its own. This belief allowed Enlightenment thinkers to believe in a creator while also not having to abandon Christianity outright to embrace science and reason. Thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Americans like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin supported deism, promoting the idea that reason should guide faith and push for religious tolerance. On the other hand, atheism, though not as popular, also grew during this time. With the rise of science, some people started doubting religious teachings altogether. Atheists do not believe in any God, arguing that there is not enough evidence to support the idea of a divine being. Figures like Denis Diderot, one of the editors of the Encyclopédie, spread atheistic ideas by promoting a view of the world based purely on natural causes, without any divine influence. While atheism was often criticized, the Enlightenment's focus on challenging authority allowed it to develop as a valid intellectual stance. Besides these secular trends, some religious movements aimed to renew Christian faith in response to Enlightenment ideas. One such movement was Methodism, started by John Wesley in the mid-1700s. Wesley and his followers thought the Church of England had grown too formal and lacked true spiritual passion. Methodism emphasized personal devotion, emotional experiences with faith, and a focus on helping the poor. Similarly, Pietism, a movement within Lutheranism, also stressed the need for personal faith and a deep emotional connection with God. Several Enlightenment thinkers directly criticized religion and questioned its role in society. Voltaire, for example, was a sharp critic of the Catholic Church. While he was not an atheist, he embraced deism and used his writings to highlight what he saw as the Church's hypocrisy and injustice. His famous phrase, "Smash the vile thing," referred to religious superstitions and the power of the clergy, which he believed held back human progress and freedom. Voltaire supported religious tolerance and believed that faith should stay out of public and intellectual life. Another important figure was Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher of Portuguese and Jewish descent. Spinoza offered a bold new way of thinking about God. In his work Ethics, Spinoza advocated for a form of pantheism and argued that God was not a personal being who intervened in the world, but was instead identical to nature itself. According to Spinoza, everything is part of one infinite reality, and God and the universe are the same. This idea challenged both Jewish and Christian views of God and led to Spinoza being excommunicated from his Jewish community. Spinoza laid the foundation for a more philosophical view of spirituality, based on reason rather than religious tradition. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, also delivered a strong critique of religion during the Enlightenment. In works like Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion and An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Hume questions the rational basis for believing in God. He doubted arguments that claimed that we could prove God's existence just by looking at the world around us. Hume critiqued miracles, saying that they went against the laws of nature, and there was not enough evidence to believe in them. His skepticism about religion encouraged a more critical approach to religious claims, one that matched the skepticism used in science and other areas of knowledge. Part 5. Politics and the Economy. Much like how empiricism, rationalism, and natural law was being applied to religion, the same was being applied to politics and the economy. The Enlightenment's thinkers began to question traditional authority, particularly religious and monarchical power. The new ideas that emerged would go on to give way to many aspects of modern-day constitutional democracies. The first of these ideas was the separation of powers in government. The French judge Montesquieu argued in his 1748 book, The Spirit of the Laws, for dividing power in government. He did not want all power in one person's hands, as he thought this led to tyranny. Montesquieu's idea was to split government into three branches: the executive, which carries out laws, the legislative, which makes laws, and the judicial, which interprets laws. Each branch would have its own job and keep the others in check, so no one branch could get too powerful. Montesquieu got a lot of these ideas from studying the British system, where power was somewhat balanced between the king, the nobility, and a growing parliament. Before Montesquieu, John Locke also made important contributions in 1689. In two treatises of government, Locke challenged the divine right of kings, the idea that kings got their power from God, and were not bound by earthly authorities like the Pope. Instead, he argued that governments should get their power from the consent of the governed, the people. Locke believed the main job of government was to protect people's natural rights of life, liberty, and property. He said governments only exist because of a social contract, where people agree to form them, and these governments should have limits and be bound by laws. Another big topic during the Enlightenment was religion's role in government. Locke, in his Letter Concerning Toleration, argued for the separation of church and state. He said the government should not control what people believe, and that religious differences should not lead to political oppression. His views on religious freedom were bold for the time, especially in England, which had recently faced religious wars and persecution. Locke believed that government interference in religion only caused trouble and was not needed to keep peace. The social contract, mentioned previously, is another key idea in Enlightenment political thought, just like the idea of the separation of powers. The social contract was a concept where people agreed to give up some freedoms in exchange for protection, order, and stability from a government. The social contract theorists thought that humanity naturally existed without government, and only through the contract, a government came into being. One of the first people to talk about the contract was Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher. In his 1651 book, Leviathan, Hobbes held a bleak view of mankind's state of nature. He thought that if there was no government, life would be, quote, nasty, brutish, and short. He believed everyone would naturally be in a war of all against all, constantly fighting to survive. To get out of this mess, Hobbes believed people should agree to give up their freedoms to a ruler with absolute power. This ruler would keep people safe, but once in power, they themselves did not have to follow the rules of the agreement. Hobbes thought dividing this power would only lead back to chaos. In complete contrast to Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another philosopher, saw things differently. In his 1762 book, simply named The Social Contract, Rousseau argued that humans were naturally good and lived in harmony before civilization and private property made things unfair. He believed people became trapped by the systems around them, famously saying that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. For Rousseau, the social contract was not about escaping violence, but about restoring freedom through shared decision-making. He thought the government should focus on the common good, and unlike Hobbes, Rousseau believed power should belong to the people, not a single ruler. Before the Enlightenment, much of Europe's economy relied on something called mercantilism. This economic policy said that the world's wealth was limited, since much of it came from gold and silver back then, so the more you controlled, the stronger your country would be. To keep this control, European governments used high taxes and gave certain businesses all the power in trade. This made their countries stronger, but it also stopped new ideas and competition from growing. As the Enlightenment spread, philosophers began to challenge these old ways of thinking. They argued for free markets and less government control over the economy. One big idea was the rise of laissez-faire economics, a French term meaning let it be. French economists like Francois Quesnay believed wealth came from farming and thought the economy worked better when the government stayed out of the way. They said taxes and rules messed up how the market should naturally work. They wanted fewer restrictions and more freedom in business, believing that if people followed their own interests, everyone would benefit. Adam Smith, a Scottish economist, built on these ideas. In 1776, he wrote his magnum opus called The Wealth of Nations. Smith said that economies run best when people look out for themselves, a concept he called the invisible hand. He also explained how dividing work into specific tasks made people more productive. For example, in a pin factory, if each worker focuses on one part of making a pin, they can make many more pins together than if they each tried to do the whole job on their own. Smith did not like mercantilism. He said a country's wealth is not just how much gold and silver it has, but also how many goods and services it produces and uses. He believed that free trade and competition made wealth grow. He thought nations should focus on what they do best and trade freely with others, so everyone gains. His ideas became the foundation for even modern-day economics, based on free markets and open trade. Part 6. The Enlightenment spreads. The Enlightenment would have not made such a big impact if its ideas had not spread far and wide. As more people in Europe and in America learned how to read, more books and magazines were being printed. This meant that more people were picking up on the ideas of the Enlightenment. The group that read these works the most were the philosophers themselves. They would send letters and essays to each other all the time to share their thoughts, debate, and build on each other's ideas. Not every philosopher was as fortunate as Voltaire or Diderot, who had rich supporters backing them. Many of them struggled by with little money to their name, working on small projects for low pay. Even so, these thinkers took pride in being part of the Republic of Letters, a large international community that values freedom of thought. This group was not limited by national borders or political rules, which meant that they could avoid censorship. The Republic of Letters liked to claim it treated everyone equally, but this was not true when it came to women. Although many women did take part in the Enlightenment, such as Mary Wollstonecraft, and even the wife of Voltaire, Émilie du Châtelet, many men stuck to deep-seated misconceptions that said women were not capable of serious thinking. They argued that women were too driven by emotions or family duties to be rational. Because of this, even though women contributed to many fields of the Enlightenment, they were often discouraged from fully joining the Republic of Letters. The idea of equality was also important to Freemasonry, a secretive social group that grew during the Enlightenment. Freemasons believed in treating each other as equals, no matter their social standing, and they supported Enlightenment values like reason and kindness. The open, secret nature of their group helped create a sense of fairness and equality among its members. As science and philosophy grew more popular, people became more interested. In response, academic schools and societies backed by royalty started popping up across Europe. Groups like the Royal Society in London and the Accademia del Cimento in Florence were open to the public. In 1666, King Louis XIV of France set up the Académie des Sciences, which focused on practical science. However, the pay for these institutions were usually low, so members often needed other jobs. These academies also did not offer many careers in science either. Unlike universities that focused on teaching old ideas, these academies worked on new discoveries. They carried out research commissioned by monarchs, helping modernize their countries against their competitive neighbors. They tested new inventions and theories, held public meetings to discuss ideas, and engaged in scientific debates. Even though they mostly served royalty, these academies also interacted with the public. They offered prizes for essays and held public experiments. French author Fontenelle believed science was not just for the wealthy and should be shared with everyone. In Britain, public experiments became a popular form of entertainment, with the Royal Society often demonstrating Newton's ideas to help replace superstitions with science. If 18th century science and philosophy were not being debated in universities, they were instead being talked about in coffee houses and salons across Europe. Social gatherings were a huge part of life during the Enlightenment. People met in coffee shops, tea houses, and chocolate shops to talk, read, drink, and share ideas. These places started spreading around Europe in the 1680s. By 1760, Vienna had at least 60 coffee houses, while London and Amsterdam had even more. These spots also became places where writers of the Republic of Letters could meet and discuss ideas, making them key places for Enlightenment thinking. Coffee houses were open to anyone who could afford a drink, which cost about 3 pennies at the time. Masonic lodges, run by the Freemasons, also played a role in promoting Enlightenment ideas like reason, morality, and equality. They often held secret meetings and rituals aimed at seeking knowledge and improving oneself. What is often seen as the culmination of the Enlightenment in its many ideas came in the form of the Encyclopédie, or encyclopedia. The Encyclopédie was created by two French thinkers, Denis Diderot and Jean-Léon d'Alembert. Their goal was simple: change the world by spreading information. The Encyclopédie was published between 1751 and 1772, containing 17 volumes of text and 7 volumes of illustrations. It featured over 72,000 articles and just under 3,000 detailed engravings. Because of its almost immediate influence, the Encyclopédie faced backlash from powerful groups like the Paris Theology Faculty, also known as the Sorbonne, and even Pope Clement XIII. This led to many efforts to ban it. Though D'Alembert left the project because of it, Diderot kept working until 1772. He died in 1784. Initially, the idea was to translate a 1728 English work, Cyclopedia, by Ephraim Chambers, but Diderot and D'Alembert quickly decided to aim higher. They wanted to gather knowledge from across the globe and pass it on to both their time and future generations. They believed knowledge could improve lives and make people more moral. They placed humanity at the center of everything, believing that understanding came through human abilities like memory, reason, and imagination. One of the biggest changes they introduced was cross-referencing, which helped readers make connections between different subjects. The Encyclopédie also had many detailed drawings, especially of technical processes in areas like architecture and industry. These drawings revealed information that were usually kept secret by trade guilds. Sharing this knowledge helped push forward industrial progress and the Industrial Revolution that was taking its first steps at the time. By 1780, 24,000 copies were in circulation across Europe, with 11,000 in France alone. The Enlightenment was a time when people celebrated reason, science, and the potential of humanity. Thinkers like Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Kant pushed for freedom, fairness, and representation. They questioned the authority of the church and absolute kings, supporting ideas like a government based on laws, the separation of government powers, and personal rights. This focus on logic and progress led to major political revolutions, shaking the systems of old to their core. In the American colonies, these ideas struck a chord with the colonists. Britain's attempts to control the colonies and impose taxes without proper representation in government caused tension. The colonists, inspired by Enlightenment ideas, especially liked John Locke's views on natural rights, life, liberty, and property. The belief that governments needed permission from the people became central to the American Revolution. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he argued that the colonists had the right to remove a government that abused their rights. The U.S. Constitution, with its system of checks and balances, and the Bill of Rights reflected Enlightenment thinking, especially that of Montesquieu. However, the revolution did not bring full equality. Despite the idea that all men are created equal, slavery continued, and many people, like women and those without property, could not participate in politics. Though the American Revolution was a revolution for liberty, it left many forms of inequality intact. In France, the Enlightenment sparked even more drastic changes. The French Revolution began in 1789 as the common people became fed up with the privileges of the nobles and clergy, further fueled by economic problems and an uncaring monarchy. The values of equality, freedom, also resonated with the revolution. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, written in 1789, was a direct result of Enlightenment ideas, emphasizing natural rights and fairness under the law. However, as the revolution moved forward, it became violent. Under Maximilien Robespierre, the Reign of Terror saw many people executed in the name of liberty and equality. Eventually, Napoleon Bonaparte took control in 1799, turning the revolution into a military dictatorship. Even though Napoleon ruled with an iron fist, he spread reforms inspired by the Enlightenment, like the Napoleonic Code, which modernized legal systems, though he also limited political freedoms. both the American and French revolutions had lasting effects. In the US, the revolution created a government based on the Constitution and Bill of Rights that went on to serve as a model for many others. In the 19th century, movements to end slavery and secure women's right to vote were influenced by Enlightenment ideas of equality. In Europe, the French Revolution inspired uprisings across the continent. After Napoleon was defeated in 1815, conservative forces tried to bring back old monarchies, but the desire for change did not die. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848, driven by calls for personal freedom and national pride, continued to fight for democratic reforms. Today, we can credit the Enlightenment for inspiring us to use logic, reason, and rationalism to explain our natural world, and its ideas of liberty, progress, and freedom for forming the basis of modern democratic societies.